a fake marriage for revenge. But love had other plans. If you're new to my channel, make sure to support by subscribing and turning on the notifications. Your support means everything. All right, let's dive into the story. Evelyn Carter never believed in fairy tales, but even in her worst nightmares, she hadn't imagined this. She sat across from Adrian Sinclair in his vast, cold study, a heavy contract spread between them. The dim, golden light flickered against the crystal decanter beside him, but nothing could soften the steel in his gaze. This wasn't love. This wasn't fate. This was a deal. Her fingers trembled over the pen. She could still walk away, still escape. But then she thought of her father, the man who had gambled away everything, the man who had left her with nothing but debt and shame. And Adrian? He wanted his pound of flesh. You're hesitating. Adrian's deep voice cut through the silence. He leaned back, watching her with something between amusement and challenge. Second thoughts, princess? Evelyn swallowed, then met his gaze with unwavering defiance. Number just, wondering how long it'll take before you regret this. A smirk curled at the corner of his lips. I don't do regrets. She exhaled, steadying her hands. One signature and she would be his. A wife in name, a prisoner in reality. A pawn in his twisted game of revenge. The ink bled onto the paper as she signed her name. The moment the final letter was written, Adrian took the contract, folding it neatly. Congratulations, Mrs. Sinclair, he murmured, his voice smooth, but laced with something dark. You just sold your soul. Evelyn lifted her chin. Maybe, but so did you. Because if there was one thing she knew, it was that no one could control love, not even the man who thought he held all the power. Evelyn had always imagined her wedding day with soft music, whispered vows, and love in the air. Instead, she stood in a grand cathedral surrounded by strangers who only cared about power, wealth, and secrets. The golden chandeliers cast a glow over the marble floors, but nothing could warm the cold tension between her and Adrian. He stood beside her, tall and imposing in his black suit, looking like a man who had won a battle, not gained a wife. His fingers were relaxed at his sides, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, they held a storm she couldn't ignore. The priest's voice echoed through the silence. Do you, Adrian Sinclair, take Evelyn Carter as your lawful wife? For a moment, just a fraction of a second, Adrian hesitated. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but Evelyn did. Then, with the ghost of a smirk, he said, I do. Her heart pounded as the priest turned to her. And do you, Evelyn Carter, take Adrian Sinclair? I do, she interrupted, her voice sharp. If he wanted to play games, she wouldn't let him think she was weak. Adrian's smirk deepened as he took her hand and slid the wedding ring onto her finger, slowly, deliberately, as if reminding her that she now belonged to him. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. Welcome to your new life, darling. I hope you enjoy hell. Evelyn lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with equal fire. You first. The guests erupted into applause. The world believed it had just witnessed a union of love, but only the two of them knew. This was war. The mansion was dark and silent as Evelyn stepped inside. The scent of roses and expensive cologne lingered, but beneath it, tension crackled like a storm. Adrian tossed his suit jacket onto a chair. Let's get one thing straight, he said coldly. This marriage is a contract, not a fairy tale. We play our roles in public, but behind closed doors, stay out of my way. Evelyn let out a dry laugh. Trust me, Sinclair, the last thing I want is to be in your way. His gaze darkened. Then follow my rules. She stepped closer, her voice sharp. Rule 1, you don't control me. Rule 2, I'm not your puppet. Rule 3, she smirked. If you regret this deal, don't expect me to save you. Something flickered in Adrian's eyes, something dark, something dangerous. Then he chuckled. "This is going to be fun, Mrs. Sinclair." He walked away, leaving Evelyn in the dim light of their so-called home. This wasn't just a marriage, this was war. Evelyn wasn't searching for secrets, but sometimes secrets find you. She had been looking for a book in Adrian's study when a small leather box caught her eye. Curiosity won over caution as she flipped it open and froze. Inside was an old worn photograph, her photograph. Her breath hitched. It wasn't a recent one, it was from years ago, back when she was just a girl who believed in love. Back when Adrian was just a stranger in a crowded world. Why did he have this? Why had he kept it? A shadow fell over her. You shouldn't be touching things that don't belong to you. Evelyn turned sharply to see Adrian standing at the door, his expression unreadable. She held up the picture. Interesting keepsake for a man who claims he doesn't care. For the first time, Adrian had no smirk, no sharp remark, just silence. And in that silence, Evelyn realized something. Maybe Adrian Sinclair's revenge wasn't just about hate. Maybe there had always been something more. The gala was dazzling, golden chandeliers, flowing champagne, and whispered scandals. But Evelyn knew the real performance wasn't on the ballroom floor. It was happening between her and Adrian. "Smile," he murmured against her ear, his hand resting possessively on her waist. "People are watching." She forced a sweet smile, but her voice was sharp. "Then let's give them a show." The music swelled, and Adrian led her into a waltz. His grip was firm, his steps controlled, just like him. But Evelyn had learned something about men like Adrian Sinclair. Control was just a mask, and she was going to crack it. She leaned in, her lips brushing dangerously close to his ear. "Tell me, Mr. Sinclair, do you always dance with your enemies?" Adrian smirked, twirling her effortlessly. "Only when they're this beautiful." Her heart skipped, a betrayal she refused to acknowledge, because this wasn't romance. This wasn't love. This was war. And the battlefield had just turned into a dance floor. The night was heavy with tension as Evelyn stepped onto the balcony, desperate for air, but she wasn't alone. Adrian followed, his presence like a shadow she couldn't escape. "Running away already?" His voice was smooth, teasing, but there was something else beneath it. She turned, arms crossed. "Not running, just tired of pretending." Adrian chuckled, stepping closer. "Then let's drop the act." Before she could react, he reached for her, his fingers tilting her chin up. His gaze burned into hers, daring her to flinch, to pull away. But she didn't. She refused to. Then, without warning, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It was a clash of fire and fury, of power and defiance, a kiss meant to prove dominance, to remind her who was in control. But when he pulled back, breath unsteady, Evelyn smirked. "Was that for them? Or for you?" Adrian said nothing. And for the first time she saw it. The war wasn't just between them. It was inside him too. Evelyn twisted the wedding ring on her finger, staring at its cold shimmer under the dim bedroom light. A symbol of marriage, a symbol of lies. Adrian stood near the window, his back to her. "Regretting the deal already?" His voice was calm, but she could hear the challenge beneath it. She let out a quiet laugh. "Should I be?" He finally turned, his gaze sharp. "That depends. Do you know what you signed up for?" Evelyn held up her hand, the diamond catching the light. "A contract, a name, a husband who doesn't love me." She tilted her head. "But tell me, Adrian, who do you really hate more? Me or yourself?" For a moment, just a flicker, she saw it. Something raw behind his carefully built walls. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. Adrian smirked, stepping closer. "Good night, Mrs. Sinclair." He walked out, leaving Evelyn alone with the ring on her finger. And the question still hanging in the air, who was truly trapped in this marriage, her or him? Evelyn had seen many versions of Adrian Sinclair, the ruthless businessman, the cold husband, the man who wore revenge like a second skin. But tonight, she saw something else. It was past midnight when she found him in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him, his fingers gripping an old letter. His jaw was tense, his eyes distant. "You look different without the mask," she said softly, stepping inside. Adrian didn't look up. "Go back to bed, Evelyn." She ignored him, her gaze falling on the letter. Who was she? His grip on the paper tightened. Silence stretched between them, thick and unspoken. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Someone I lost." Evelyn should have walked away. She should have let him keep his secrets. But for the first time, she saw cracks in the walls he had built. And against all logic, all reason, she wanted to see what was behind them. Evelyn knew better than to play with fire, but with Adrian, she was already burning. The rain poured outside as she stood in the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding. Adrian was in front of her, his shirt slightly undone, his hair messier than usual. He had just returned from a late meeting, but the tension between them had nothing to do with business. "You keep looking at me like that," Adrian murmured, stepping closer, "and I'll start thinking you've forgotten why you hate me." Evelyn smirked, refusing to back down. "Who said I ever hated you?" Something flickered in his gaze, something dangerous, something forbidden. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, just for a second too long. They shouldn't be here, shouldn't be this close, shouldn't feel this alive. But when Adrian leaned in, his breath warm against her skin, Evelyn whispered, "This is a mistake." Adrian's lips barely curved. "Then why aren't you stopping me?" She had no answer because the truth, she didn't want to. Evelyn wasn't sure when the war between them had shifted, when the hate had blurred into something else, something dangerous, but she felt it now, in the quiet of the night, as she lay awake beside Adrian. His breathing was steady, his face peaceful in sleep, a version of him the world never got to see, a version she wasn't supposed to care about. She reached out, hesitating before her fingers could brush against his. What was she doing? This was a man who had married her for revenge, a man who had vowed to ruin her, and yet, why did he make her feel safe in a way no one ever had? She closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember. This wasn't love. It couldn't be, because if it was, it would mean she had lost. And Evelyn Sinclair never lost, but as the night stretched on, she couldn't shake the feeling that this time the battle was already over. Adrian Sinclair never lost control. Never. But tonight, as he watched Evelyn laugh, really laugh, for the first time since their marriage, he felt something shift inside him, something he wasn't ready for. They were at a charity event, putting on the perfect act. Hand in hand, stolen glances, soft smiles. It was all part of the show, except for the first time it didn't feel like a show. "Careful, Sinclair," Evelyn teased, leaning in. "People might think you actually enjoy my company." Adrian smirked, but his grip on her waist tightened. "Maybe I do." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Evelyn's smile faltered, her eyes searching his. For once, she wasn't throwing daggers, she was just looking, like she saw something real. And that terrified him, because if there was one thing Adrian couldn't afford, it was this, falling for the woman he was supposed to destroy. Adrian Sinclair didn't talk about his past, because in his world, the past was a weakness. But tonight, under the soft glow of the study lamp, with Evelyn sitting across from him, he made a mistake. He let her in. "Tell me something true," she said, her voice quieter than usual. No teasing, no sharp edges, just curiosity. Adrian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He should have shut her out, should have given her another lie. But instead he said, "I wasn't always like this." Evelyn tilted her head. "Like what?" He met her gaze, and for the first time he let her see it. The boy he used to be, before revenge, hardened him into this man. Cold? Calculated? Someone who only knows how to destroy. His voice was low, almost bitter. Once, I actually believed in love." The confession hung between them, heavy and unexpected. Evelyn's fingers curled around the edge of the desk. "And now?" Adrian smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Now I know better." But Evelyn wasn't fooled, because for the first time since she had met him, Adrian Sinclair sounded like a man who wished he still believed. And that scared her more than anything. The rain poured heavily, matching the chaos inside Evelyn's heart. She shouldn't be here, shouldn't be standing in Adrian's study, drenched and breathless with his piercing gaze locked onto hers. But she was, and she didn't know how to walk away anymore. "What do you want from me, Evelyn?" Adrian's voice was low, rough, like he was fighting a battle he didn't want to win. Evelyn swallowed hard. "The truth." Adrian let out a sharp breath, stepping closer. "Too close. You don't want the truth." "Yes, I do." Her voice trembled, but she held her ground. "Because I think—" She hesitated, the words heavy on her tongue. "I think you don't hate me as much as you pretend to." Silence. Thick, charged silence. Then suddenly Adrian was in front of her, his hands gripping the desk behind her, trapping her in. "You think wrong!" His breath was warm against her skin, his words almost convincing. Almost. Because his eyes, they told another story. And when he finally whispered, "You should leave," Evelyn knew. He wasn't talking about the room, he was talking about his heart. But it was too late. She was already inside. Evelyn knew this was dangerous, but she couldn't stop. Adrian stood in front of her, his expression unreadable, his breathing uneven. She had pushed him too far this time. "You think this is a game?" His voice was sharp, but there was something else beneath it, something raw. Evelyn swallowed, her heart hammering. "Number, but I think you're lying." Adrian's jaw tightened. "About what?" She took a step closer, her voice barely a whisper. "About wanting me to leave." His eyes darkened. For a moment it felt like time had stopped. Then he moved. His hands gripped her waist, pulling her against him, and before she could even take a breath, his lips crashed into hers. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't careful. It was fire meeting fire, a battle neither of them wanted to win. By the time they broke apart, gasping for air, Adrian's forehead rested against hers. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. Evelyn closed her eyes. She should. But when she finally spoke, her voice betrayed her. "I can't." Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart still racing from the kiss that never should have happened. This wasn't supposed to be real. Adrian was beside her, his breathing steady, his arm loosely draped over her waist. It should have felt suffocating. It didn't. She turned slightly, watching him in the moonlight, the man who had married her for revenge, the man who was never supposed to fall for her. But he had. And worse, she had fallen too. Evelyn reached for his hand but stopped just inches away, because love wasn't part of the deal. And if Adrian ever found out the truth, the secret she had buried deep, he would hate her more than he ever loved her. She blinked back the ache in her chest and whispered, "I'm sorry, Adrian." Because soon, this love story would end in heartbreak.